Hello everyone, in this video we're going to be talking about the parts of a flower and pollination, a topic usually taught at Key Stage 3, and I might delve into a bit about selective breeding of plants, which I have talked about in another video, but only briefly in this one. So let's start at the top. Now these pink structures that you see around the flower, these are called petals, and they come in a mixed array of colours and have different scents and smells. And the purpose of those petals would be to attract a bird or an insect to the flower. So if it's an insect pollinated flower, we'll talk about pollination and what that involves. If it's an insect pollinated flower, it's going to have very bright, attractive looking petals. Let's talk about this structure here in green. Now this is what we know as the filament. And you can see at the top of the filament, there's these kind of like orange ball-like structures, the way I've drawn them here. Now they are called anthers. So we have an anther on top of, or if you like, sitting on top of the filament. Now those represent the male reproductive parts. If I put M here, the male, they're the male reproductive components of the flower. And collectively, that anther and filament form what we know as the stamen. That's S-T-A-M-E-N. So the anther and filament form the stamen. So let's continue down. And we'll come to the female reproductive part of this flower in a moment. You can see that we have almost small leaves here beneath the flower. These bits I've coloured in dark green. Now they're what you call sepals. So we have sepals, and then that would lead to this here that I will label the stem. Now the stem sometimes is referred to as the peduncle. So I'll put both names in, but the proper name, especially the upper part of the stem beneath the flower, is the peduncle. So we've put in the petals, we've put in the male reproductive part, the stamen. We've got the sepals in the stem. And what you can't see is just, it's almost at this region here, below the petal. So it's just beneath the sepals, underneath the stem, is a part called, and in fact I'll label this with a dashed line because it's just below there. We have something called the receptacle. So just at the point where the stem kind of comes up and meets the top part of the flower, if you like. So the receptacle is just at the top part of the stem. Just putting it in there for completeness sake. Now let's think about some of the female parts of this flower, which actually is everything that I've really kind of left to last. This whole structure that you see in green here, in fact I'll use red to highlight this whole structure here on this diagram represents the female component of the flower. And we call this the carpel. So the carpel represents the whole green structure in the middle, the female component. Let's think about the individual parts, if you like, of this carpel. So at the very, very top, we have a stigma. Now, I will come back to the idea of pollen. I know I haven't mentioned pollen yet, but I will come back to the pollen in just a moment. So we have the stigma here, then this long part coming down from the stigma. This is what we call the style. Then we're left with this bottom sort of rounded chunk here. Now the whole of that bottom part is our ovary. So we've got the ovary at the bottom of our carpel. Now you'll notice in the ovary there is a sort of reddish structure that I've coloured in. That represents what we call the ovule. It's a section of the ovary called the ovule, and it has the egg. So the egg cell that is to be fertilised is within that ovule, which is part of the ovary. So we have the female parts there. So I'll put in, I did melt, the carpel is the female component of this flower. So we've got the stigma, style and ovary forming the carpel, the anther and filament forming the stamen, and then we're left with the petals, the stem, receptacle and the sepals. Now let's think about some questions. They're the basic parts of the flower. Let's think about some questions you might get asked about these parts. So let's think about what contains the male sex cell. Now the male sex cell is called pollen, and it's the anther. It's the anther that contains that pollen. That's what these little dots are. In fact, if I label it in a sort of like orangey colour, if you like, to match what I've done before. So those little dots that you can see, they're meant to represent the pollen. So in fact, what we'll do is shrink the screen here, just so we can, and I'll put it over to here because I'm going to be drawing a diagram in a moment, just to make one particular point. So the male sex cell. The male sex cell is the pollen, and the pollen is found on the anther. So that's important to note. The female sex cell, that is what we call the egg, and that is found within the ovary. So if we think of the sperm and egg in a human, the sperm being the male sex cell, the equivalent in a flower is the pollen in the anther, and the equivalent of the egg in the female human in a flower would be also an egg within its ovary. The ovary is the female reproductive organ, and the bit that receives the pollen during fertilization would be the stigma, the part of the carpel at the top. So let's think about pollination and fertilization. So for this, what we're going to need to do is we need to almost zoom in on one particular bit, if you like, and it's this central carpal part, especially this region here that I'm just putting a big pink circle around. So I'm going to take that bit and I'm going to, if you like, zoom in just on that bit there, because what I want to do is talk about now pollination. So I'm going to redraw out, in fact, not the best diagram, but just this central carpal part. I'm just going to redraw the So I'm hoping you can appreciate that what we have here is the ovary. We've got the ovule here. This top part here is our stigma. So what I've just drawn is just the carpal part by itself. Now, when the pollen lands on the stigma, either by wind or having been carried by an insect, that is called pollination. So the wind can blow some pollen, or an insect can come and pick up some pollen. And let's go with the insect. It may go fly over to another plant. And when that happens, the pollen would land on the stigma. So for this, we're going to colour it in, let's use blue for this. We're going to imagine that some pollen, in fact let's stick with the orange that we had from before. We're going to imagine that some pollen drops onto that stigma, the top part of the carpel. So it's been blown by the wind and lands on the stigma of another plant, or it's been carried by an insect to that stigma. That is called pollination. Now, once the pollen lands on the stigma, we get what's called a pollen tube forming. Now from that pollen, if you like, a tube forms down the style through the ovary towards the egg in the ovule. So a pollen tube forms down the style to the egg in the ovary. And then that pollen simply passes down that pollen tube in this direction. So it goes down the pollen tube and it goes to meet, let's just draw the egg in place, the egg there. Now the pollen passes into the tube, and when it reaches the egg, that's what we call fertilization. So when the pollen, the male sex, then lands on the stigma, that is pollination. And when the pollen tube forms and that pollen goes down the tube all the way into the ovary and meets the egg, that is what we call fertilization. Okay, so what we've done in this video is label the parts of a flower. We've said what those parts do. We've talked a little bit about pollination, and we've finished with fertilization of that flower. Now I did say I'll mention briefly about selective breeding. If we wanted to selectively breed or choose which flowers we would pollinate, for example, I mean, in this video I've said an insect or wind can take randomly pollen from one plant and flower, take it to another. If I wanted to choose which two plants I would fertilize together, I could take this one flower that I have, I could take a paintbrush, and using the paintbrush I could actually take off some pollen myself from the anther. I could take another very specific plant that I have chosen and kept maybe under a black bag, like a bin bag for example, just to make sure that nothing else can pollinate it. I could lift up the black bag, and with the paintbrush I can paint on, if you like, almost the pollen onto the stigma of that second plant. So I myself can take, using a paintbrush, some pollen off one plant and choose which plant and which flower to then put that pollen onto. And now that is how you selectively breed flowers. I'm choosing where that pollen ultimately is going. I'm choosing the stigma that pollen will land on. It's a little bit extra, and I have talked in more detail about it in my video called Selective Breeding, but this one was just about parts of the flower and a bit on pollination. Okay, I hope all that helps.